For 2 years, China has been discreetly making reserves, large reserves, discreetly, because for 2 years, certain categories of imports no longer appear in the official figures communicated abroad by the Chinese authorities. The nature of the reserves in question arouses the curiosity of observers. We already know that it is massively buying gold in anticipation of the BRICS projects, as I mentioned in a video a few months ago. But this time it's not just about gold. We are talking about vital raw materials such as cereals and hydrocarbons, or strategic ones such as industrial metals, rare earths, and minerals. This treasure, we now know that she did not consume it, but that she stored it in secret places inside the territory. And when we observe the quantities concerned, there are enough to ask a lot of questions. Which fly stung Xi Jinping to suddenly push him to stock up? What is he afraid of? Or worse, would he have plans that he knows will disrupt China's supply routes in the near future, such as, for example, resolving the fate of Taiwan? In this video, I propose that you observe the phenomenon together and try to decode the message, because now is the time. China's dependence on foreign resources. As we know, for almost 30 years, to accompany its insolent development, China has swallowed up tons and tons of raw materials, energy, and metals to power its industries, and meat and cereals to feed more and more Chinese. But its economy has now reached maturity. Its growth definitely fell below the 10% mark in 2011, and has fluctuated between 5 and 7% since then, with no hope of returning to its previous levels. After the fall of its real estate market, the largest in the world, China is looking for a new growth engine. Meanwhile, investments are falling and consumers are being cautious and spending less. The result, prices are falling a little too much, which puts Chinese companies in an embarrassment to sell their goods on the national territory. Normally, such a phenomenon should lead to an overall decrease in the consumption of raw materials in proportion. And yet, this is not the case. In 2023, raw material imports to China broke records and increased by 16% compared to 2022, and they continue to climb, with an increase of 6% between January and May, while the country's economic situation does not justify it. So, what happens to these goods? The answer is simple. They are stored. For some time now, China has been importing oil and natural gas, but also cereals and metals at a much faster rate than usual, which it has been storing in new infrastructures. Huge tanks or warehouses just out of the ground over the last 3 years. The Chinese oil storage capacity has increased from 1.7 to 2 billion barrels, or almost 4 months of consumption at the natural rate. Between 2010 and 2020, the volumes available to store natural gas increased sixfold, reaching 15 billion cubic meters, and since then, they have increased to 25 billion, or 23 days of consumption. The goal is to reach up to 55 billion cubic meters by Christmas. Here and there, in the Chinese provinces or along the coasts, there are also huge grain silos intended to receive wheat, soybeans, corn, and other cereals purchased from Brazil, Argentina, Russia, and the United States. At the end of this season, China's granary should contain 51% of the world's wheat stocks, 65% of corn stocks, and 42 million tons of soybeans, which represent more than 4 months of consumption. Finally, his appetite for metals has not subsided. Quite the contrary. It collects everything that is available, such as copper, nickel, bauxite, cobalt, and rare earths, from Australia or Chile. This shopping fever is not without awakening some memories in this ISE store. Many empty shelves, this one usually devoted to ready-to-eat, is filled with strawberries or raspberries. But why? Because despite its image as the world's leading commercial power, sitting on mountains of natural resources like many other countries, China is dependent. It has not always been, but since 2020 it has suffered from the same ailment as Europe. Even if it is a weakness that Beijing would like to keep secret, like almost everyone else, China depends on its suppliers to keep its machine running. Its industries must find 97% of their cobalt and 70% of their bauxite elsewhere. It is also dependent on its energy suppliers. It has large reserves of coal, but they are insufficient for its needs. It needs to import 40% of natural gas and 70% of its oil. Finally, it has recently lost its food sovereignty. Even 25 years ago, the country produced enough to feed all the Chinese. Today, it is necessary to bring in 85% of foreign soybeans to satisfy the demand, and 100% of the coffee, palm oil, and dairy products consumed each year. So Xi is vulnerable, and Beijing does not want to hear this word. In China, storing has become a habit since the end of the Cold War. But never had the reserves reached such a level, and never had they filled up so quickly either. 3 recent events have accelerated this need to raise, which is not compulsive. First, the trade war with the United States, with a conflict that entered the hard way in 2018 because the Trump administration abruptly increased customs duties on products made in China. Objective: to fight against these $350 billion of Chinese imports, which compete with American companies directly at home. A situation unacceptable for Washington. Then, the COVID pandemic revealed flaws in the global logistics system, causing blockages in transport and major supply problems. Finally, the war in Ukraine has pushed up the prices of raw materials and proved to the whole world the particular taste of the Americans for sanctions and embargoes. Today, 3 new reasons can justify China's behavior. First, there is the threat of Donald Trump's return to the presidency of the United States. Between the Democrats and the Republicans, Beijing has made its choice. Despite the deterioration of relations between the 2 superpowers since the arrival of Trump, it is he who has the preference of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping sees in his unpredictable behavior a possibility in the long run to serve Chinese interests. For example, he is less able to create new international partnerships than the Democratic candidate, who is used to this kind of exercise. But for Trump, as for the Harris clan, China remains the enemy of the United States, and therefore, anything can happen overnight. And whoever it is, the new government could decide to put pressure on China's suppliers to limit the quantities or the nature of the goods they export. America could also decide on other types of sanctions that could still intervene in the context of the trade war, but also, and more worryingly, around Taiwan. The second threat: since 1949, Taiwan has enjoyed a special status from mainland China. It is a Chinese province, but ruled by an autonomous government. For the archipelago itself, Taiwan is a unique, hyper-industrialized and cosmopolitan place, which houses the most beautiful factories of the world's leading manufacturer of electronic chips, TSMC, the result of collaboration with American financiers. Taiwan has also been under the protection of the United States since the 70s. As long as the Taipei government remained loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, everything was going well. But since 2016, the independentists have succeeded each other at the head of the province, and nothing is wrong anymore. The calls for freedom, official recognition, and frequent American interference have put Beijing into a black rage and led Xi Jinping to reaffirm at each New Year's speech that Taiwan will return to the ranks willingly or forcibly. And he even set a deadline: 2025, I might as well say tomorrow. But even without armed conflict, all this could lead directly to Beijing's third pet peeve: new supply problems linked to the blocking of sea lanes. With an environment like this, it's no wonder that China is playing squirrels and starting to stash reserves everywhere. Consequences. It's not without consequences. First, the rapid accumulation of raw materials is pushing up prices on international markets. After rising sharply in 2022 with the Ukrainian conflict, cereals, meat and dairy products and oils returned to more reasonable levels in 2023, but this decline has already been erased in just 6 months. Global supply chains are under pressure, and shortages appear at the very end. And the risk of degradation is all the greater that some countries are thinking of imitating China, if only to guard against climate crises. Finally, the tension is still rising a notch between the Western Bloc gathered around Washington, India included, and Beijing. The former clearly seeing in this sudden storage strategy the preparation of the latter for a future conflict. Conclusion. What is Xi Jinping planning? An economic winter, climatic disasters, new commercial or political conflicts? All this at once, probably, without it being possible to say which risk worries him the most and what the consequences will be for the rest of the world. The next episode of the War of the Superpowers will take place next November. The outcome of the American elections will depend on the Chinese strategy and the evolution of relations between the two eternal adversaries. Until then, count on us to closely follow all the developments and bring you the most important ones. See you soon on Money Vision.